How familiar are you with the state of sales taxes of your gold and silver holdings across the country? Well, this is a very important topic, not often discussed on media, and we're happy to have on JP Cortez, Policy Director of the Sound Money Defense League, to discuss this very topic. JP, it's your first time on Kitco News. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, David. I'm excited to be here.
JP, as the Policy Director of the Sound Money Defense League, you have your finger on the pulse of legislation across the country when it comes to sales taxes of gold and silver bullions. Now, recently, as people on this show are aware, because we've discussed it many times, the state of Arkansas has eliminated sales taxes of gold and silver sales. Can you talk about your role and the role of your organization behind this legislation?
Yeah, great. So this was actually, the Arkansas bill was a bill that was introduced 2 or 3 years ago, and unfortunately it didn't go anywhere. We introduced it a couple of years ago. I went out, I testified, I tried to garner grassroots supports, and unfortunately it just wasn't able to make it out of committee a couple of years ago. And so this year it was reintroduced. We picked up a House side sponsor on the bill that was very passionate about the issue as well, and we were able to communicate and get in touch with coin dealers across the state, gold and silver investors across the state, and really just apply a lot of grassroots pressure to this same committee that it died in a couple of years prior. So I went out, the Sound Money Defense League went out, and we devoted a lot of resources, a lot of time to getting the word out, to making sure that people were contacting their legislators, to making the arguments as to why it is inappropriate and unfair to be charging sales taxes on precious metals. And fortunately, we were able to finally get this one passed.
We're going to be talking about the Sound Money Defense League and your mission in just a bit. But first, let's talk about the broader landscape of sales taxes. You've given me a few interesting charts to show. This first one, the green map here. Tell us what these different color codes mean.
Great. Yeah. So this is the map that was included in the 2020 Sound Money Index. And that was published in December of last year. So that has been, there has been some movement on some of these issues between the publishing of that index and today. But this is a chart here that shows the state of sales tax across the country. So the lighter shaded states are going to be the ones that have exempted either fully or partially have removed sales taxes on precious metals. The darker states are the trouble states. These are the states that are still charging you somewhere between 5 and 10% when you go to your local coin dealer or your local pawn shop to purchase a silver eagle or a gold bar. These are the states that are still hammering you with an inappropriate, unfair sales tax on top of the purchase price of your purchase.
Now, so when we're talking about taxes, what are some of the highest taxes on a state level that you can expect, just based on this chart here, the map?
Well, so Tennessee is probably the highest state sales tax in the country. So in Tennessee, and we've been working on bills there over the last several years to eliminate the sales tax, and there's a bill currently being heard there. So that's an ongoing fight that we are continuing to fight. Tennessee will charge you close to 10% on top of the purchase price of your item. So between the $1,900 that you might pay for a bar of gold, you'll also get hit with close to 10% on state and local sales taxes. And so for a lot of reasons, that's just wrong. For the same reason that if you walked into a gas station in Tennessee and asked to exchange $1 for 4 quarters, the gas station attendant would not tell you, okay, great, that would be $1.07, please. So for that reason and many more, it's inappropriate to be charging taxes on these metals. You're just exchanging one money for the other.
Why is there such a big discrepancy between sales tax rates across the country? You're the expert, not me, but I would imagine that this would be a federal law, not a state by state law.
Yeah, so there is no federal sales tax here in the United States. Every state has its own sales tax laws based on the revenue needs of each state or the perceived revenue needs of each state. And so a variety of different states in some cases might choose to intentionally keep sales tax very low as a way to incentivize purchases and such. Some states really desire that revenue. They're sales tax hungry politicians in this country that really want that sales tax. And so they're willing to jack up rates regardless of how that might affect industries or business or general behavior.
So going back to this map here, now I'm making a generalization, but on first glance, it appears that the states that charge the most in taxes, the dark green states, are usually Democrat states. Now there's a few exceptions, of course, and the other side of the coin, they're usually Republican states. Is this a partisan issue?
No, so the Sound Money Defense League is a nonpartisan group, and this issue doesn't have to be partisan at all. Like in this case, for example, Ohio is a very Republican state. Tennessee, Kentucky, these are all Republican states that Republicans control the legislature and the governorship in many cases. But these are states that are still charging sales tax and high levels of sales tax at that. Whereas you have some other states that might be considered blue. For example, Pennsylvania has eliminated their sales tax. That would be considered a blue state. New Jersey is currently considering measures to remove the sales tax on precious metals. That's a state that's typically considered, left leaning. So this isn't really a partisan issue. It's just needs of the state.
That's a good clarification, JP. So it's not really tied into the policy of whether the fiscal or tax policies of that state. It's really a metal specific issue on a state by state level. It's not, you can't make the generalization that just because, let's say, California is a blue state and therefore they want to charge high sales taxes on everything. So you can't make that statement, right?
Yeah, not really across the board. California is one of those states that partially has repealed sales tax on precious metals. Hawaii is another blue state that this year we introduced legislation and it passed overwhelmingly, unanimously out of one committee, passed overwhelmingly out of the other. Unfortunately, they shut down their session for a little bit this year, so that wasn't able to pass. It missed the deadline because of a procedural thing. But that's a bill that is expected to be reintroduced next year and hopefully will pass. So no, there isn't a ton of overlap between blue state and red state and whether they tax the metals or not. Unfortunately, states across the board are taxing metals unfairly with no regard to their political background.
I want to move on to this chart now. This is the Sound Money Index key. Break this down for us, JP. What does this chart show?
Yeah, so this chart here is going to be the overall scores, ratings of the Sound Money Index, where the lightest shades depict the states that are best at sound money, the states that provide the best pro-sound money environment in the country. So that'll include Texas, Wyoming, South Dakota, Washington. These are all states that have enacted policies that provide a very pro-sound money climate in their states. States that have removed taxes, be it sales tax or income tax. States that do not charge high levels of sales tax rates. States that maybe have reaffirmed gold and silver as money in the state. States that in some cases have established in-state depositories. States that have attempted to bolster their state reserve funds or state pension funds with gold and silver. So states that are enacting some of these policies that benefit in-state businesses, in-state investors, and in some cases even in-state revenues.
Okay, so tell us about the differences between the dark blue states and the light blue states on this map. What have they done differently? What are some of the policies and directions that the light blue states have taken that have, in your opinion, taken the right direction versus, let's say, a dark blue state?
Yeah, so the light blue states, Texas, for example, is a state that has no sales tax, or rather, it has eliminated sales tax from gold and silver purchases. It has no income tax, so there is no income tax on capital gains when you go to sell back your metals. They have reaffirmed gold and silver as money in the state. They have explicitly codified it in state legislation. They have enacted an in-state gold depository, a privately chartered, sort of publicly owned, publicly used in-state depository to store private metals and public metals. And so that's another thing that Texas has done. They have taken their teachers' pension fund and they owned about $1 billion worth of gold, and they use that as an asset. They're holding that to preserve, to bolster their teacher pension fund in the state, and they're using the in-state depository that they've built to protect it. Whereas many other states, some of the darker states, for example, Kentucky charges sales tax on precious metals, and it charges at a high rate at that. It charges income taxes on capital gains when you go to sell back your metals. It has shown no sign of believing or affirming that gold and silver are money, even though that's constitutionally, written in. They have nothing in the way of gold depositories or have taken steps to protect state reserves or state pensions or state trust funds with this hedge against inflation that has existed for 4,000 or 5,000 years. Instead, they invest in risky assets, in other financial instruments, in emerging world debt, and not in many cases, they don't own a single ounce of gold.
So why is it that some states don't have at least 10% of the reserve in gold and silver? This is a fact you gave me offline. Very interesting. Tell us which states those are and why.
Well, frankly, it's most states. Off the top of my head, there are only 2 states that have gone forward to preserve their assets, their state assets, taxpayer-funded assets with gold and silver, and that is the $1 billion in the Texas Teacher Pension Fund, and Ohio recently bolstered the Ohio Fire, I think it's Fire and Police Pension Fund with gold and silver. There are just analysts that, pensioners, state reserve funds, the government accountants, government people that are doing fiscal analysis that will tell you that you're more likely to get, 10% return if you choose to invest in, emerging world debt or other financial risky trading instruments without any consideration for the fact that gold has served as a hedge against inflation for 5,000 years, that has preserved its purchasing power, that gold and silver offers protection against drawdowns and volatility. So there are plenty of reasons why a portfolio, it would behoove financial portfolio managers to allocate gold and silver to their portfolio to protect their funds and ultimately their taxpayers, their citizens. But many states have just chosen not to do it. We introduced several measures in Wyoming a couple of years ago that banking industries, pensioners, people came out strong to lobby against these measures because they're chasing returns that many times don't exist, and they're feeling like they have to outpace inflation, the inflation that is inevitably coming. And so these measures just generally are not welcomed.
Now, I'm wondering whether or not these taxes have impacted sales of bullions within that state. For example, let's say I live in California. Well, why can't I just drive down to Texas, which is not that far away, and buy my gold and silver there, where there's no sales tax?
Mm-hmm. Exactly, and so that's another thing that state legislators aren't realizing, aren't wanting to understand. Businesses are losing out. Investors are leaving the state. People are going to other states to buy precious metals, and so businesses are being undermined. Jobs are being undermined. State tax revenues are even being undermined. So money is fleeing the state. It is leaving because legislators believe that they will get more by enacting this tax, and that's just not the case.
All right, I want to talk about the Sound Money Defense League now and how you've managed to persuade some of these legislators to take your side. Starting with the history of the league, why was this established, and why, in your words, do you think it's important to reduce or even eliminate sales taxes?
Yeah, so the Sound Money Defense League has been around now for about 6 years. It's a public policy project that really understands that on a grand general level, monetary dysfunction starts at the federal level. The Federal Reserve is, a toxic institution that is harming the poorest among us. But with that understanding, even considering the understanding that the problems largely stem from the federal level, there's so much that states can do to help mitigate some of that damage. And so the Sound Money Defense League takes that state policy approach. And so we'll go state to state and we'll work and we'll cultivate a group of policy influencers and politicians and nonprofits in the state and publishing media and other things in journals and publications that appear in the state to make the argument, to make a holistic, robust argument as to why these policies hurt the poorest among us, the people on fixed income, the pensioners, security, people who are on Social Security. These are people that are harmed most by this federal policy of dollar devaluation. And so we go state to state. largely with the belief that sound money is the linchpin of a prosperous society. Without it, society falls apart. They're unable to allocate investments well or allocate money well. They're unable to plan long term, and it generally incentivizes big governments that can fight endless wars, that can produce welfare warfare systems. All of these things are a product of moving away from sound money. And so to restore sound money, while again, the problem is mostly federal, the things that states can do to help mitigate some of those damages um, is what we aim to do. And so we aim to remonetize gold and silver largely by removing the disincentives in the way of purchasing, using, and buying and selling the metals.
Okay. And what kind of resistance have you been met with while on the road proposing this legislation?
Well, it's been plenty. And the arguments, I think, largely come from just being uninformed, not understanding the role that gold and silver has played in American history, not understanding the role that gold and silver has played in world history, not understanding the purpose of money, what money is supposed to do. And so for all of those reasons, legislators in many cases tend to not necessarily like these bills or not really at least understand them without
Right.
having to be walked through why these things are important.
So let's suppose I'm a senator and I'm speaking with you and I say to you, JP, I don't understand why we should do this if a bullion dealer is crafting or has hired a mint to craft a specific coin with a design on it. Maybe it's partly art, partly money. Anyway, there's some labor involved, there's costs involved. It's a product just like anything else. You go to a store, you buy jewelry, you pay taxes on that. Why should citizens be exempt from paying taxes on silver and gold bullion coins?
Well, I think the argument is that gold and silver are money. Constitutionally, they're money. Historically, they've been money. And so for the same reason you don't tax money, you wouldn't tax gold and silver, because buying gold and silver is simply an exchange of one form of money, that being the US dollar, or more accurately, the US Federal Reserve note, because it's no longer a dollar, it's just a paper IOU. You're exchanging Federal Reserve notes for another form of money. And that exchange isn't taxed normally. Mm-hmm. The other reason is that sales tax, are taxes on final consumed goods. And that's not what gold and silver are. Even if you do believe that gold and silver aren't money, that they're an investment, states don't tax investments, not on the purchase of investments anyway. And so states don't tax ETFs, mutual funds, all of those things. And so it's inappropriate to tax precious metals investments as well, because they are inherently held for resale, just like any other financial instrument.
And just on that note, you said that gold and silver are money. So I'm guessing you think that they should be legal tender then, or no?
Yeah, so I think legal tender is a special government designation. The government waved a wand and said these pieces of paper, referring to the US dollar or the Federal Reserve note, these pieces of paper are legal tender. They are now accepted. They have all of the attributes of money. But that's not how money, or at least good money, is determined or created. That's sort of the bigger picture. Good money, sound money, isn't created at all. It's discovered. And gold and silver has been chosen by the market for 4,000 or 5,000 years now. So gold and silver already are legal tender in all of the ways that matter, in that people accept them for goods, they accept them for services if you want to use them. So long as the Federal Reserve note exists, yeah, you're probably never going to have someone buying McDonald's with a gold eagle. And that's just Gresham's law, that bad money, the dollar will continually push out good money. So people will hoard the metals. But that's okay. They are money in all of the ways that matter. And legal tender is a government designation that only applies when you're trying to attribute monetary properties to things that don't naturally have them. So affirming that gold and silver are money, affirming that they're legal tender is great, but it doesn't provide a whole lot of actual difference.
Yeah, I think Donald Trump was famous in that he accepted gold as payment from his tenants before. So I think in a private contract, people still do that. But you're saying it's going to be a while before it's federally enacted.
Yeah, I would say so. Or even some states have already taken steps to affirm gold and silver as legal tender, to affirm gold and silver as money. But again, even if states allow for you for a transaction for something like this to take place, that's great. But in many cases, it probably wouldn't happen because again, Gresham's law says that the bad money will continue to push out good money. But so being allowed to do it would be great. And that's one of the things on the Sound Money Index. And sort of another thing that dovetails into that is gold clause contracts. Being able to make a long-term contract, say you and I want to engage in a 30-year contract where you want me to pay you back in gold. And that used to be very common back 100 years ago, 150 years ago. Gold clause contracts were common. Today, they're less common, in part because states won't necessarily affirm the specific performance required. So today, if you were to write a contract out like that, you might get to the end of the contract and you could take that to a judge and the judge will rule, okay, you can pay in US dollars, but the US dollar is not a reasonable facsimile. It's not comparable to gold and silver, especially not over long term.
Finally, you're on the road this week. Tell us where you'll be going and speaking with this week.
Yeah, so I'm actually in Ohio right now. Tomorrow, we're having 2 hearings before the House and the Senate on bills to remove sales tax on precious metals in Ohio. Ohio had an exemption just a couple of years ago that was repealed. And within a year or two of its being repealed, state legislators are realizing that they have made a grave mistake. And so now they are reinstituting the exemption, and we're hopeful that that will be passed. In Maine tomorrow, there's also a hearing to remove the sales tax on precious metals as well. In Tennessee, there are bills being considered to establish an in-state depository or to study the effects and the possibility of establishing that. There are also measures in South Carolina that are still active and Iowa that are still active to remove income tax, capital gains on the sale of precious metals. And then, of course, there are a couple of federal bills that have been introduced. Congressman Mooney out of West Virginia has introduced the Monetary Metals Tax Neutrality Act, which would, on a federal level, remove capital gains taxes from precious metals, and the Gold Reserves Transparency Act, which would it's essentially the audit the gold bill from that Congressman Ron Paul had 8 or 9 years ago, but further. So not only is it important that precious metals are held in a safe in Fort Knox, in West Point, wherever they are, wherever the U.S. holds those, it's also important to ensure that these metals aren't encumbered, that these metals haven't been swapped or leased, or that someone else thinks that they might own them. So those are federal projects that are happening right now as well.
Thank you very much, JP. That was very informative. Thank you for your time.
Thanks for having me on.
And thank you for watching Kitco News. I'm David Lin.